Thank you so much for coming in this early morning. And so in this paper, we are going to solve one of the very major questions in the labor market, and that's how to explain gender disparities in the labor market. But we did in a double focus approach. And we specifically worked on 3 advanced Asian economies, including Japan, Korea, and Singapore. But let me tell you the last message first to see what's going on in this paper overall. And that's if women have the same opportunity to use their accumulated human capital in the labor market as men do, the gender gap would be much smaller than what we have now in the labor market. And let me introduce you and also tell you the motivation behind this paper. Actually, when it comes to the gender disparities, it's well known for everyone that it's a global challenge. But the thing is, it has different picture in different countries. And also, when it comes to explaining the gender disparities, human capital is one of the essential and major driver of gender disparities. But there's a big question, how really we can measure human capital? When you see most of literature, they rely on quantity-based measurement of human capital, and mostly they rely on years of schooling and educational attainment. But there's a big question, and there is a big problem with that. How to really measure human capital quality and long life learning, ongoing skill adaptation. So we cannot really answer this question using years of schooling or educational attainment. Because in years of schooling, you may equally treat someone who graduated from MIT in US and or MIT in Vietnam, although they have completely different educational quality. But in this study, we try to find out and we try to measure human capital completely in a different way. To measure the stock of human capital is to assess the adult skill level directly, rather than proxy based on years of schooling. Unfortunately, we have a data set that's surveyed by OECD, which is called PIOC, that they directly measure the human capital based on people skills level, rather than years of schooling or educational attainment. And we designed 2 objectives for our studies. The first one is to compare the wage and also at the same time employability return to cognitive skills across 3 countries, which is Japan, Korea, and Singapore, which they are surveyed by PIOC. They are an Asian member of PIOC survey. And also the second thing, we analyze factor behind gender disparities, both in terms of wages and also in terms of employability. So we have 2 main objectives. And when it comes to the motivation in this study behind that, to better understand really the distinct and also overlapping factor that drive gender disparities in terms of wage and employability from a multidimensional human capital perspective, in 3 advanced Asian economies focusing on dual impact of cognitive skills. So let's go through very fast on literature review. When it comes to skill measurement, so most of the literature, they rely on educational attainment, which is quantity-based. But when we really consider, some studies suggest that educational outcome or cognitive skill that people learn during their lifelong learning are more reliable for proxies for human capital or for overall skills level than just attainment, how long you really stay in the school. And when it comes to the skill effect, we can consider the skill effect both in terms of labor market success and also in terms of gender disparities. In terms of labor market skills, or especially cognitive skills, may have both micro level effect and also macro level effect. And micro level effect, we can see skills or cognitive skills can have a direct link with people's earning and also better employment. And in big level of economy or in macro level, also it can have impact on economic distribution and economic growth. But when it comes to education attainment nowadays, most of the literature say that we don't have a strong relationship between years of schooling and economic growth, but there is a strong relationship between cognitive skill and economic growth. And also in terms of gender disparities, cognitive numeracy skills and skill utilization can significantly play a greater role in explaining gender disparities, both in terms of wage and employability in the market. We have 4 major contributions. The first one, we uniquely contrast 2 types of gender disparities, which is gender disparities in terms of earning and gender disparities in terms of employability. That earning can cover a qualitative part of the gender disparities, and employability can cover the quantitative part. So we focus both at both parts. It means we have double focus approach on quantity-based and also on quality-based. The second, we consider 3 advanced session economies because there's a literature gap. There's a study gap here to cover that one. And the third one, we consider heterogeneity that over life cycle, over skill level, and we use like a kind of different and new decomposition for decomposing the gender disparities in the labor market, which is called Gilbert decomposition. And lastly, we can suggest, we can have a empirical contribution for that, or policy implication, that one-size-fits-all policy approach may not be effective in the labor market. So we need cause-specific policy adoption rather than providing one policy for the whole labor market. So when it comes to empirical strategy, firstly, we just use a very simple OLS, but in this OLS system, you see instead of educational attainment or years of schooling, we have cognitive skill as a main variable. And also we have gender variable because we are thinking about gender disparities in the labor market. And also in order to consider the change over the wage distribution, we use quantile regression. But there is a problem because there is a, endogeneity problem, both in terms of measurement error, reverse causality, and omitted variable. So we consider those things, the first one, measurement error and reverse causality using IV, and the third one adding some extra control variable to see what will happen in our outcome. And when it comes to gender disparities, in gender disparity case, we use Gilbert decomposition, which is based on omitted variable bias. So the first formula is just show the unadjusted or raw gap, which you only can see the female or the gender variable here. But in the second formula, not only we have the gender variable, we have all other factors or covariate that we can have in our model. And then by using all other covariate and using some kind of auxiliary regression, this one auxiliary regression, we can really decompose gender disparities in this study to 3 main factors: demographic factors, accumulated human capital, and human capital use. How people really use their accumulated human capital in the labor market. So when it comes to data and descriptive statistic, we use data from the OECD, specifically PIOC data, which stands for Program for International Adult Assessment Competencies, which they measure 3 types of cognitive skills: literacy, numeracy, and problem-solving skills in technology-rich environment. But for our measurement, we use numeric skills rather than literacy and problem solving, because in literacy, the literacy skill can be affected by the language. So I mean, when you ask people in English language, when they don't have, their native language is not English, so it may affect that one. But in numeracy skills, it's mostly like a good proxy for skill level. And problem solving, there's a measurement bias because it's related to people choice. They can answer to that question or they cannot answer to that question. Yeah. Asked in their own. No. I mean, when it comes to answering the question in Korea, it provided in Korean language. Korean language. When it comes to like UK, it provided in English language. But maybe in UK, there are people living which they don't have English as a native language. That's why they can be affected by the language that they answer to that question. So we specifically use just 3 advanced Asian economies rather than focusing all the countries, because there was a literature gap only in these 3 countries. So, and also there is a large gender gap in Japan and Korea, but lower gender gap in Singapore. Although there are 3 advanced Asian economies, but they show completely different picture. So we worked on these 3 countries, which they have completely different picture to see what's going on really in these 3 countries. For example, Japan. it shows the highest scale score among all OECD countries. And Singapore, it shows the lowest scale score among all OECD countries. And Korea is around the middle. But when it comes to gender gap, Japan and Korea has the highest gender gap among all OECD countries. Although Singapore has lower scale score, but the gender gap is very low. So we consider these three countries in this three extreme point to see what's going on really in these countries. So when it comes to descriptive statistic, you can see that there is a large gender gap, both in terms of wage and in terms of employability in Japan and Korea, but lower in Singapore. And when it comes to, in terms of cognitive skill or cognitive ability gap, you see there's a large gap in cognitive numeracy skills in Singapore rather than Korea and Japan. So it means although Singapore shows a lower skill level, but there is a large gender gap in skill. Although Japan shows a higher scale score, but there is a lower gender gap in skill. But when it comes to experience, another factor, there's a large gap in experience in Korea and Japan and lower experience gap in Singapore. Although when you see the age factor, the difference in age between male and female is statistically insignificant. You see like 40, 40, 39, 39, 41, 42, just very small difference, but there is a large gap in experience. And in this table, you can see there is another factor which is called the Cohen-D test, which really shows how large is the gap. As you see, the gap in wage and employability is large in Japan and Korea rather than in Singapore. And when it comes to empirical finding, and the first just using a simple OLS for these three countries, we may have three important messages. The first one, overall, the wage return to numeracy skills is much higher than the employability return. The thing is, the wage return is a kind of qualitative measurement of labor market success. And the employability is just quantitative because it's asked, are you employed or not? Are you working or not? So it doesn't mean how largely effective numeracy skills or overall cognitive skills, but there can be a large difference when you are working, and it shows the quality of work. And there's another thing, that higher wage return linked to a higher employability return across these three countries. If you see both, Singapore shows a higher employability return at the same time as a higher wage return. So it means the skill or overall cognitive skills has large value in Singapore labor market rather than in Korea and Japan labor market. And the last one, gender gap, you see the gender gap both in terms of employability and in terms of wage is much lower in Singapore than Japan and Korea. So the employability return and also wage return is high in Singapore, but the gender gap is low in Singapore. So it means cognitive skill has high value in Singapore labor market rather than Japan and Korea labor market. And when it comes to age cycle or the heterogeneity over life cycle, when you see there is a very interesting result here. As you see in Japan and Korea, there's a large gender gap in employability in the entry age cycle between 25 to 35, specifically between 30 to 34, which is a kind of marriage age in Japan and Korea. So because of that marriage, they get out of the labor market, so the employability getting low. But after that, in the next age cycle, which is prime age, you see there's a large gender wage gap. Although in that entry age in Korea, you don't have any significant gender wage gap. But just moving one step forward in the prime age, you see there's a large gender wage gap. Why? Because in the entry age, this large employability gap leads to somehow experience gap. In the next stage, then due to experience gap or due to somehow an experience gap leads to loss of human capital, because there's a kind of another literature that shows when unemployment duration increase, So according to, based on the level of duration, you may lose some of human capital. That's why there's a larger gender wage gap in the next stage. But there's another interesting thing for the Singapore, even in the early age cycle, which is between 16 to 24, even we have advantage for female. So they have higher wage and higher employability than male, because they have like higher chance to be hired, young female in Singapore labor market, and a higher chance to get higher earning than male counterpart. When it comes to skill level, across skill level, both in Japan and Korea, you can see the gender wage gap and gender employability gap increase over the skill level. Because when the skill level of female is getting larger in Korea and Japan, so it will be more problematic for them to have good job and have better wage. So when they cannot get better wage, so they may somehow disappointed from entering to the labor market. That's why then in the next stage, employability gap is getting larger as well. But in Singapore case, the employability gap is larger in the low skilled group, and also is larger for the wage in the low skilled group. Why? Because in Singapore, mostly low skilled employment or low skilled job or male dominant job. So that's why there's a large gender gap in employability. But when it comes to wage gap, there's a large wage gap in the high skilled group in Singapore labor market. Although they are high skilled, but still they have problem to get higher than high management level. That's why there's a larger gender wage gap. In PYOC survey, they provided already the measurement for the skill level. So when we think about PYOC survey, there's 6 skill level. Skill level 1 and below level 1, level 2 and level 3, level 4 and level 5. So yeah, it's given. So we redefined in just 3 skill level. We just combined skill level 1 and below level 1 as a low skill, skill level 2 and 3 as a middle skill, level 4 and level 5 as a high skill. Yeah. So even also for the yeah, that's already given. No, it's based on some kind of plausible values that PYOC survey already provided for them. So they divided this skill level based on that measurement. So that's why based on that measurement, it's not depend on the skill, educational level. As already in the beginning I told, PYOC survey is completely independent of educational attainment. So they directly assess the human capital by using a kind of scale test. So it's like a TOEFL test or like IELTS test. So and when it comes to like endogeneity, so we really don't think about to solve the endogeneity problem, but rather we want to see how different alternative identification model may show specifically the same like trend that we considered based on our like baseline model. As you see in all of them, it's so complicated table. All the alternative identification model that we used for measurement error and also reverse causality and also for the omitted variable, we have the same trend as we have in our baseline model. So Japan, larger wage gap, larger employability gap. Singapore, lower gender wage gap, lower employability gap, at the same time, higher return. So when it comes to the gender gap decomposition, we use the Gilbert decomposition. And in terms of wage, when it comes to the gender wage gap decomposition, we adjusted wage gap based on demographic profile, accumulated human capital, and human capital use. Accumulated human capital refers to years of schooling, experience, numeracy skills, and literacy skills. And human capital use It stands for the use of numeracy, literacy, computer, non-cognitive skills, and problem-solving skills at work. So how you use those kind of skills that you have when you are working. But when it comes to employability gap, we only adjusted for demographic profile and accumulated human capital. Why is so? Because as you see, this skills considered only at work. So when you are not working, so you cannot use your human capital at work. That's why we only decompose the gender employability gap based on demographic profile and accumulated human capital at back, wage gap based on accumulated human capital use, and demographic profile. When you see, when we adjust based on these three factors, the gender wage gap in all countries shrink very largely, more than 50%. And even in Singapore is around 67% shrink the gender wage gap. And also when we only consider demographic and accumulated human capital, the gender employability gap is also shrink and reduced. And when we decompose based on when we want to find the contribution of each factor in explaining the gender wage gap and also gender employability gap, you can see in Japan and Korea, human capital use can explain a larger portion of gender wage gap. If you see the portion that can be explained by human capital use in Korea, it's 8%, but for the accumulated human capital, just 6.8%. So it means that in Japan and also in Korea, female accumulated human capital underutilized. What does it mean? It means that although they have skills, they have ability to use, but they don't have the chance to use. But in Singapore, accumulated human capital somehow well utilized, both for female and male. That's why the proportion or the percentage contribution of human capital use, it's lower in Singapore rather than in Korea and Japan. And employability gap is still the same. So our main message is gender wage gap decomposition shows that women face larger underutilization of human capital in Korea and Japan and smaller in Singapore. And when we see specifically each human capital measure, the contribution of literacy use, the green color, is very large in Japan and Korea, but very small in Singapore. It means the literacy skills of women in Japan and also in Korea labor market is underutilized. Although they have high literacy level, but they cannot use. Specifically when it comes to Japan and Korea, those people who are not working, they show a higher literacy scale than those people which they are working. And accidentally, the larger portion of those people which they are not working, they are female. So it means, although they have something, but they don't have the chance to accumulate or to use that one. So when it comes to the change in age, so we have another message. The percentage contribution of human capital use increases as people age in Korea and Japan. This means that women face greater underutilization of human capital as they age in Korea and Japan. You see, when it comes to Korea and Japan, the green area, it shows the contribution of human capital use. The percentage proportion is increasing when the age increase. But in Singapore, it's not like that. Because overall, the contribution of human capital use is not so large in Singapore. And it's the same for experience over age. So as age increase, the experience gap increase. Why? There's two major problem. As age increase, the first employability gap increase. And this employability gap leads to increase in experience. At the next cycle, experience gap leads to employability gap. So that's why as the age of male and female increase in Japan and South Korea, the experience gap increase, and also it leads to larger employability gap in these two countries. For the last things, Singapore is doing well. But how? When it comes to labor force participation, In Japan and Korea, we have M-shaped labor force participation for female. So it means when they arrive to somehow 30 years, they get out of labor market for their marriage, having children. But we don't have that kind of M-shape in Singapore. So they can work over life cycle. But in Japan and Korea, they get out of labor market and they re-enter again somehow in their 40s. So this gap leads to like larger experience gap, and also this larger experience gap can contribute to human capital loss and also employability gap in the list. But for male, we don't have that kind of situation. When it comes to like trends of gender gap in labor force participation, also the gender gap in labor force participation is higher in Korea and Japan than Singapore. In terms of like female in vulnerable employment, is also large in Korea and Japan, lower in Singapore. In terms of proportion of women in managerial position is lower in Japan and Korea, but larger in Singapore. In terms of wage gap, is large in Korea and Japan, lower in Singapore. In terms of fertility rate is low in Korea. You see, after 2016, the fertility rate is getting lower in Korea, and also after 2016, the gender wage gap is also getting lower in Korea. It means we try to solve the gender wage gap issue by causing another problem. So it means reducing fertility rate caused gender gap reduction, but this match, low fertility rate, is also not good for economy. And finally, in conclusion, as you see, we did a dual focus approach to consider both wage and also employability return and gap. So when it comes to accumulated human capital of women is underutilized in Korea and Japan, but well utilized in Singapore. And in terms of policy implication, we should really think about providing cause-specific policy to exactly see where we have problem and how to solve that problem to do not cause another problem. Like how to solve gender wage gap, not by the price of reducing too much fertility rate, rather than we should find another solution.